Have you ever read a book and retained nothing? Or started a complex book and stopped after a couple of pages because you were lost? Or decided to read a complete book only to find out at the end that it wasn't what you were looking for, many hours now lost? If you'd like to turn the tides against our lack of deep literacy, then stay tuned for a review of How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler. A couple of years ago, a researcher from San Jose State University, Ziming Liu, conducted research that indicated the new norm in readers was that people engage in skimming instead of deep reading, partly due to how we focused our readings on tablets and smartphones. Combine that to the fact that in the USA, 54% of adults are said to have a literacy level below 6th grade level, and in Canada, 48%. Not only that, but a recent research shows that about 50% of US citizens haven't read a book in the past year. With all of this, what you have is a large group of people that have trouble understanding what they read, trouble reading complex books, and trouble sustaining enough attention to do any of those, even just reading a book. But reading is a skill and an art. It can be taught and it can be learned. Most importantly, we as readers can be guided towards a better reading that will help understand more about the world around us. It is for this reason that today I will be reviewing How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler, first published in 1940, which deals with the topic of how can we read better, where better is understood as being, according to each book, the attention it deserves, whether that means less or more attention. In his book, he shows that there are many levels of reading and that each of them have a particular role to play in the greater scheme of understanding both books and themes across books. Anybody interested in reading better and developing a methodology for reading, or in the great works of the Western canon, would be well advised to read it. Mortimer J. Adler, born in 1902 within a non practicing Jewish family living in the USA, is a philosopher and professor of law coming from a Thomistic paradigm. In the 1930s, before writing this book, he taught at the law school of the University of Chicago and wrote books on Plato, practical philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, and the philosophy of science. He continued writing many books and encyclopedias throughout all his life, founded the Great Books Foundation, and much later converted to Catholicism, while finally dying in 2001. Originally, Adler wrote the book to show people how to read great books. He thought most people didn't know how to properly understand what they read, but it's something that can be taught, which is what he tried to do. The book was reedited later in 1972 with the participation of Charles von Doren, an editor and public figure. This is the version I'll be reviewing. In between the two editions, Adler saw a decline in the reading capability of university and college students, which prompted him to think that the active reading he was proposing was more than ever necessary. The book is about 400 pages and it is decidedly of a practical nature, although there are theoretical sections dealing with readings in the place of books and learning. To summarize in one sentence this book, it's about improving human potential in what he calls the art of active reading through a sustained effort and dedicated methodology. For him, active reading is about exerting more willful effort by demanding more of oneself and the text in the reading activity. The analogy given is that of baseball. In that sport, the receiver is still performing an activity. He is not passive, only the ball is passive. Active reading is therefore the skill of catching every sort of communication and meanings, just like receiving is about receiving all kinds of balls. As pitchers and catchers are cooperating, so should the writer and the reader. This is how successful communication is established towards a common end. He gives us a definition of the art of reading on page 8, the process whereby a mind with nothing to operate on but the simples of the readable matter, and with no help from outside, elevates itself by the power of its own operations. The mind passes from understanding less to understanding more, the skilled operation that causes this to happen, or the various acts that constitute the art of reading. End quote. In order to demonstrate this, he talks about the definition of types of books, the main questions to ask of books, the four ways of reading and their stages and roles, and various reading tips. The book itself is divided into four major parts. One part on reading, its definition and dimensions, including the first two levels of reading, elementary and inspectional reading. One part on the main level and methodology of the book, analytical reading, one part on how to approach different kind of books based on its genre and types, and one last part on what he calls the ultimate goal of reading, which is the fourth level, syntopical reading, and the growth of the mind through active reading. He mentions many types of non fictional works, such as practical and theoretical, but also fictional works. The book itself ends with a list of great works to read and small appendices to help flesh out his methodology. I will now address two very pertinent and interesting aspects of his praxis, the reading questions and the four ways of reading. I think those are the two major arguments of his thesis with regards to reading better. For him, it's important that the active reader question the book he is reading. In order to do this, Adler suggests four basic questions a reader should ask a book he is reading. First question: what is the book about as a whole? Second question: what is being said in detail and how? Third question: is the book true in whole or part? And fourth question: what of it? Answering these questions then become a goal for the reader. More so, asking the question themselves is just as important as it will prompt the reader to look for a better and generally more truthful understanding of the text. Although not formalized this way in the book, there is a fifth question prior to those four to ask: should I read this book? Adler is very adamant about the fact that we shouldn't read all books, as they are not all useful and clearly not all useful to us in particular. In order to supplement these questions, or in some sense to be able to adequately answer them, Adler gives four ways of reading the text: elementary, inspectional, analytical, and syntopical. These are really methodology or processes of reading and should not be confused with levels of interpretation, such as with the medieval tradition of quadriga. The first level is simply to read the words, the sentences, and paragraph and grasp their meaning. It's about normal reading. The second level of reading is the first true reading, and it's about pre reading or superficial reading. That is, reading in diagonal, being able to adequately chase down important information on the back cover of the book, in the introduction or the conclusion, in the table of content, the indexes, and so on and so forth. It's a very active but surface reading that gives us insight into the types, the genre, the content, and especially the aim of the book. It is highly useful to answer the fifth invisible question that I added earlier about whether a particular book is useful to read or not. The third level of reading is analytical. It is meant to really delve into and understand the book and its subject. It's divided into three stages: understanding, which is about structural rules, the rules of outlining; interpreting, interpretative rules; and criticizing, critical rules. For this level of reading, he lays out rules that help put this process into practice. So, for the first stage of analytical reading, rules for finding what a book is about, he gives the following: classifying the book according to kind and subject matter, stating what the whole book is about with the utmost brevity, enumerating its major parts in their order and relation, and outlining these parts as you have outlined the whole, defining the problem or problems the author has tried to solve. Then the second stage of analytical reading is rules for interpreting a book's content, and he gives those the following way: coming to terms with the author by interpreting his keywords, grasping the author's leading proposition by dealing with his most important sentences, knowing the author's arguments by finding them in or constructing them out of sequence of sentences, determining which of his problems the author has solved, which he has not, and of the latter deciding which the author knew he failed to solve. In the third stage of analytical reading, criticizing a book as a mean of communication for knowledge. Do not begin criticism until you have completed your outline and your interpretation of the book. Don't say that you agree or disagree, or you just suspend judgment until you can say that you understand the book. Do not disagree disputatiously or contentiously. Demonstrate that you recognize the difference between knowledge and mere personal opinion by presenting a good reason for any critical judgment you make. And the way in which we criticize is to show wherein the author is uninformed, show wherein the author is misinformed, show wherein the author is illogical, or show wherein the author's analysis or account is just incomplete. Finally, the fourth level is syntopical reading. This level is about bridging the gap between various books and subject in order to grasp at some deeper understanding. It's about understanding well a particular question, laying out the views of the authors, supporting them, analyzing the discussion between them, and finally coming to a greater truth. However, for Adler, syntopical reading is paradoxical, just as with any hermeneutical undertaking. Unless you know what books to read, you cannot read synthopically. But unless you can read synthopically, you do not know what to read. If we ask the same question that he asks of the books that you read, is this book true, good, beautiful, in whole or in part? I think personally, in terms of positive appreciation, that his methodology and aim are not only well exposed but very much true. I can say that I arrive at similar conclusion, although less systematically, than him after years in university in reading both philosophy, hermeneutics, pedagogy, and so on and so forth. I also appreciate how he is able to distinguish between method and aim. For him, the effectiveness of reading is determined by the effort and skill of the reader, while the way he reads is determined by his goal, either entertainment, information, or understanding. His view of books as being unaided discovery taps a lot into the writing of some church fathers and late antiquity writers such as Cassiodorus, who saw books as being replacement for teachers. In any cases, I think his method is sound and his goals are noble. In terms of points to improve or where I might bring some criticism, I think the major flaw of the book is the verbosity of it. Being a practical book, I think it would have benefited to start out with rules and methods and explaining them as he goes along. The extra content given in some parts of the book are to me completely unnecessary, even to a beginner on the subject. Clocking in at a bit more than 400 pages, it could easily have been 100 pages less without losing quality or content. On a side note, I really like how he treated imaginative literature, which we kind of call fictional works. It is a particularly complex subject, which would require more than the current medium and current video for it. However, I will point out to some similarities with J.R. Tolkien in his essay on fairy tales. First, both agrees that beauty, although having something to do with truth, is much harder to analyze than truth with our rational minds. This is even more evident in imaginative literature that tries to convey experience and not necessarily knowledge. Secondly, both view the imaginal aspect of literature as a positive to develop humans. Escapism, in a way, for both of them, is about escaping to a greater reality. And finally, Adler seems to have a very particular view on creating this kind of imaginative literature that alludes to a subcreative role within mankind, as per what Tolkien himself developed in his works and letters. Here is a quote from Adler, which itself recontextualizes a quote from Aristotle. Quote, the imaginative writer we have seen creates a world in which his characters live, move, and have their being. End quote. And so, what of it? In conclusion, I think that this book is worth reading if you want to get a more focused and deeper level of reading. I could not discuss everything in it, and it has a lot more to offer. It bears great practical and theoretical advice, and the list of great books to read at the end is a nice touch. Withstanding its shortcomings, such as lack of brevity, it is still a book that holds its own, especially when combined with other cognitive research into reading and learning. And not only that, but even the review of this book was made using his own question about the four question of a book. One thing I'd like to put more emphasis on to close this video is the importance of being active in reading activities. This means both the input and the output. On the input side, everything the author said is right. You need to ask questions to the book, read it at multiple level of cognitive abilities, understand the author and its own term, and so on and so forth. Let's not forget also that we need to aim higher. It's important to read books beyond our capacity if we want to grow as readers. But outside of the book, it's also important not to flood ourselves with inputs. This can be about the book itself, such as trying to read too many reviews, too many articles on the subject of the book before actually delving in. Or it can be outside of it, such as being inundated with social media, news, and chats and text messages, and so on. The quality of input during our day is very important for our learning. Even more so, it's important also to consider the output you get from the reading activity. You can do this in varied forms by talking about the books you read to a friend or family, writing to yourself of the future a review, sharing what you learn with someone, or straight up sharing your notes, joining a book club to discuss books, creating a blog to write down your thoughts on the books you read, etc. It can be even trying to put into action in your life the things you've inputted. Some research shows that to learn and understand properly a book or a subject, we should do more output than input. In our day and age of social media, we are probably doing it very wrong. For more information on this, you can read The Power of Output by the Japanese author Shion Kabazawa. On the general subject of methodology of reading, I will also share a video in the comments by Jocko Willings, an ex-Navy SEAL colonel, on how we read fast and efficiently. In all cases, have a good reading.